quiet archive record. Tonight, we're stepping into a slow unfolding. Settle in. Let the outside world dissolve, and gently descend into tonight's world. Tonight, we are listening to an archive stitched together from meeting notes, flight plans, checklists, and the small, private recordings that never appear in press conferences. It is the record of a decision that took decades to mature, and then, suddenly, became a schedule. You will hear how a mission to Mars is built in pieces, how cargo goes first, like a house being delivered to an empty lot. You will hear the patient work of making a distant place a little less hostile by sending power, shelter, tools, and a return vehicle that waits like a promise. You will travel with the crew across the quiet months between planets, where the real drama is not explosions, but maintenance. Fans that must keep turning, filters that must keep breathing, bodies that must keep adapting, and minds that must keep finding reasons to be gentle with one another. And you will arrive through a thin atmosphere that refuses to behave like Earth's, down onto dust that has not felt a human footprint. You will listen to the long middle of the story, the season of routines, repairs, scientific work, and simple domestic moments that prove the crew is still human. When the mission ends, it will not end with fireworks. It will end with a return, with gravity again, and with a new kind of quiet, as the world tries to understand what it has just done and what it must do next. This is a mission to Mars. Chapter 1: The decision that did not fit on a slide. The mission began in a room with bad acoustics and perfect coffee, a long table, a projection screen, a dozen people whose job was to imagine a future that would not embarrass them. They had charts for everything: fuel margins, radiation dose projections, cost per kilogram, probability of launch delay, probability of public boredom. What they did not have a chart for was the feeling that had been gathering for years, a quiet impatience, a sense that Earth was becoming too small for the stories we told ourselves. No one said it out loud at first. They used other phrases. They said strategic capability and planetary resilience and technology demonstration. They said supply chain maturity, an international partnership. But if you listen carefully to the archived audio, the unpolished recordings from the back of the room, you can hear the real sentence forming. It is a simple sentence. It is a sentence that does not fit on a slide. We are going. For decades, Mars had been close enough to dream about and far enough to postpone. A planet you could point to on a clear night. A place that lived in photographs and in museum dioramas. A destination always described in the future tense. Robots changed that, not by making Mars less dangerous, but by making it less imaginary. Every orbiter that mapped the planet turned romance into data. Every rover that survived another winter turned a headline into a routine. The first time a wheel track showed up in a close-up image of dust, Mars stopped being a dot and started being a ground. And as Mars became more real, the old arguments changed. The question was no longer, can we picture it? The question became, can we keep people alive there long enough to do real work and bring them back? That last part mattered. It mattered so much that it dominated everything. In the internal documents, return was not a chapter at the end. Return was a requirement at the beginning. If the crew could not return, then the mission was not approved. Not because anyone was sentimental, because the first crewed expedition to a new world would be remembered for whatever ended it. and the archive contained too many stories, where the ending swallowed the rest. So the first decision was not about a rocket. It was about an architecture, a way of arranging the mission so that the risk could be distributed, not eliminated, distributed. Mars missions punish the impatient. The launch windows are narrow and rare. The travel time is long enough that every system becomes a long-duration system. A component that fails on day 20 is not a small problem. It is a problem with hundreds of days left to live. In the early proposals, Mars looked like an extension of a lab, a controlled environment, a place where everything could be modeled. Then the engineers arrived. They brought a different kind of honesty. They brought lists. They brought failure modes. They brought the habit of asking again and again, what happens when this breaks? And what happens when it breaks at the worst time? The mission would not be a single vehicle. It would be a choreography of launches, a slow assembly in orbit, cargo first, then propellant, then the crew. It was an approach that sounded cautious until you understood what it required. It required patience on a scale that politics rarely tolerates. It required a public that would watch years of preparation without demanding a climax every month. It required a budget that could survive election cycles. The archive record includes a small note about this, written in plain language. It says, "The mission timeline must be boring to outsiders. Boring is stability. Boring is stability, so they plan to send hardware ahead. Not symbolic hardware, not a flag and a camera. Practical hardware, power, shelter, a communications relay, spare parts, medical supplies, and most importantly, a return vehicle. A return vehicle on the surface is not just transportation. It is a psychological object. It is a promise you can touch. It is the difference between an expedition and an exile." The arguments around this were not gentle. Some planners wanted to keep the return ship in orbit, to reduce risk on landing. Others wanted it on the ground, ready and waiting, so the crew could see it. In the end, they chose the waiting. They chose the sight of a silent machine on red sand, proof that the mission had a way home. There were other decisions too, quiet decisions that sound small until you live inside them. How much privacy does a crew need? How much noise can a human brain tolerate for months? How many spare filters does it take to turn fear into a checklist? In one planning session, someone asked a question that made the whole room pause, not because it was profound, because it was practical. What does the cabin smell like after 200 days? No one laughed. They wrote it down. Because smell is not a luxury. It is morale. It is memory. It is the difference between a habitat and a container. Another person asked about the first week on the surface. Not the first step, not the televised moment, but the first week when the cameras are less interesting. Who cleans the airlock? Who repairs the suit seals? Who decides what to fix first when 3 things break in one afternoon? The mission planners learned to respect these questions. They were questions that came from people who had lived in cramped places before, submariners, Antarctic winter crews, people who understood that bravery is not a moment, it is a routine. Crew selection became its own archive. Thousands of applicants, medical exams, long psychological interviews, group simulations where nothing went wrong, and then, later, simulations where everything went wrong at once. The goal was not to find superheroes. The goal was to find professionals who could be tired and still be kind, people who could be bored and still be careful. people who could disagree without turning it into a fracture. And then came the training that did not look like training. Long weeks in mock habitats, long days in desert heat, underwater rehearsals where every movement was slow and deliberate, time in caves where the outside world became a concept. In the archive, there is a small clip from one of these sessions. A crew member is asked what they miss. They do not say sunlight. They do not say family. They say, "I miss wind on my face." It is a strange thing to miss, until you remember that wind is the feeling of a planet. As the mission design stabilized, the public story began. The speeches, the press kits, the slogans that had to fit on banners. But the archive keeps the quieter story. The story of revisions, the story of caution, the story of people who argued about gasket materials and antenna placement, because those arguments would decide whether someone would come home. One of the last internal reviews includes a line that reads like a confession. "We are building a small, moving world. It must forgive human error." That was the real decision. Not to be perfect, to be forgiving. The final approval did not arrive as a single cinematic moment. It arrived as a series of signatures, as a funding vote, as a set of manufacturing slots reserved years in advance, as an agreement between agencies that did not naturally trust each other. And then, quietly, the schedule became real. In the archive copy, the decision is recorded as a resolution, a paragraph, a signature, a date. But the real beginning of the mission was not the signature. It was the moment the room went quiet, and everyone realized that the plan was no longer a thought experiment. Outside the building, traffic moved. Phones rang. People went home. The world continued, as it always does, and somewhere, in a factory that made parts most people would never see, a machine started cutting metal, not for an idea, but for a flight. Chapter 2, Freight Before Footprints. The first launches carried no people, no cameras inside a cabin, no voice saying good morning from orbit. They carried anonymous mass, tanks, solar arrays, structural trusses, a habitat module packed like a careful shipping crate, a return vehicle that would spend a long time waiting. In public announcements, these were called precursor flights. It is a gentle phrase. It suggests a warm-up. In internal notes, the phrase was different. They called them the freight trains. A freight train is not romantic. It is heavy. It is slow. It exists to make the impossible ordinary. The mission planners knew a simple truth. You do not send people to a place before you send the things that keep people alive. Not if you want the story to have a second chapter. So cargo went first. Not one cargo lander, but several, and each one was its own small mission. A separate argument with gravity, heat, and thin air. Mars is close enough that a human imagination can reach it, but it is far enough that you cannot improvise your way there. Every bolt has to be in the right place before the first engine lights. From Earth, the launches looked familiar. A countdown, a column of fire, a bright vehicle climbing through sky. From orbit, the mission looked different. It looked like assembly, like logistics, like a construction project done in silence. Cargo modules met in space and docked. Propulsion stages arrived and attached. Solar panels unfolded like dark wings. And then, when the stack was ready, it departed. Not with drama, with a long, patient push. The archive contains the departure burn as a graph, a smooth rise, a steady line, then a return to calm. It is strange to realize that history can look like a calm line. During the months of cruise, the cargo flights were mostly unattended. They were watched, of course. Their systems were checked. Their temperatures were monitored. But they did not need reassurance. They did not need a joke at dinner. They did not need a reminder to sleep. They were machines. And machines, when they work, have a kind of peace. When the first cargo stack arrived at Mars, it did not arrive like an airplane. It arrived like a problem, a heavy thing going too fast. A planet with an atmosphere too thin to help and too thick to ignore. In mission simulations, the phrase came up again and again: entry, descent, landing. 3 words, 1 long breath. The heat shield did its work. The radio went quiet. Parachutes opened in air that barely wanted to hold them. Engines lit at supersonic speed. On Earth, the flight controllers watched a delay. They watched the past. By the time the first telemetry showed a parachute deploying, that moment had already happened. On the screens, it was all numbers. In the body, it was something else. It was helplessness. When the signal returned, it returned without emotion. A sequence completed, a velocity reduced, a touchdown confirmed. Then, on an orbiter pass days later, the first proof arrived in a way the public could understand. A tiny shape on red ground, a new shadow, a scatter of disturbed dust. The first cargo lander carried power. The planners had argued for years about what kind. Solar is clean and familiar, but Mars has dust. Mars has seasons. Mars can dim itself for weeks, so the mission did not rely on one source. It brought solar arrays in wide, foldable blankets. It brought batteries, and it brought a compact generator meant to run quietly. A patient heartbeat that did not care about weather. Power is not glamorous, but in the archive, the first successful power-up is marked with an exclamation point. Because power is life. Power is air circulation. Power is heat. Power is the ability to make water stop being ice. The second cargo lander carried the habitat, not the entire home, just the first room of it. A pressure vessel with layers, an inner skin for air, an outer shell for protection. A lock that would be cleaned again and again until cleaning became a ritual. The habitat was landed empty. The air inside it was not yet the crew's air. It was sterile, filtered, and still. The third cargo lander carried tools and spares. If you could weigh the mission honestly, you would weigh it in spares. Extra seals, extra valves, extra sensors, entire duplicate systems sealed in foam. The fourth cargo lander carried the return vehicle. It did not look like the sleek ships people drew as children. It looked like a practical machine, a small rocket staged for ascent, a cabin sized for sitting, not standing. Systems designed for one hard job. And around these cargo landers, the mission placed a ring of quiet support, relays, beacons, small surface packages that did one thing reliably: a weather station, a seismometer, a camera pointed at the horizon to record dust storms moving like distant smoke. Then came the most delicate cargo, a plant, not a tree, not a garden, a small greenhouse rack, seeds and growth media, a plan to raise a little green in a world that is mostly red. This was not for food, not at first. It was for the crew's eyes, for the part of a human brain that relaxes when it sees something alive. The archive includes a note from a psychologist on the mission team. It says, "Give them something to care for. Caring is a tether. Caring is a tether." After the cargo arrived, Mars became a place with property, a place with equipment, a place where something was waiting. And then The mission entered a phase that is hard to explain to people who love quick stories. Waiting. The return vehicle had to be checked. Its tanks had to be confirmed. Its valves had to be tested. Its batteries had to be kept warm enough to remember what they were for. The power systems had to prove themselves through a season. The habitat had to hold pressure through day and night cycles. The relays had to survive a dust storm without losing their minds. And because Mars is far, this waiting was measured in long intervals, orbiter passes, data downlinks, telemetry that arrived after the events that created it. On Earth, a small team began to live on Mars time without leaving their building. They would wake for an orbiter window. They would check the health of a battery. They would send a command to cycle a pump. Then they would wait for the reply. It is easy to think of this as remote control. It is not. It is correspondence. A slow exchange of questions and answers. Sometimes the answers were reassuring. Sometimes they were not. A hinge might report unexpected resistance. A solar blanket might deploy a little unevenly. A heater might draw more power than expected. None of it was dramatic. All of it mattered. In one archived incident, a dust storm reduced the solar output sharply. The numbers fell. The batteries carried the load. The generator took the lead. On Earth, the team watched the graph. They watched it the way you watch a sleeping child's breathing. Not because the child is in danger, because you cannot help caring. The mission planners had always known this would happen. They had designed for it. But knowing something and watching it are different. In the end, the storm passed. The sky cleared. Dust settled. A small robot, built to be patient, crawled along the edge of an array and brushed where it could. And the base remained quiet, waiting. There is a strange tenderness in building a home for someone who is not yet there. You imagine footsteps that have not happened. You imagine laughter inside walls that only hold silence. The cargo phase was full of that tenderness, because every successful check was a kind of invitation. The archive contains images of the landing site taken months apart. The hardware is always small, a few bright panels, a cylinder, a shadow. The planet around it is immense, and yet those small shapes mean something. They mean the mission has crossed a line. The mission has placed a stake, not a claim, a commitment. By the time the crew training reached its final year, Mars already had a place with power, a place with shelter, a place with tools laid out in boxes that would not be opened for a long time, a place with a return vehicle waiting like a promise with an expiration date. And on Earth, in that same room with bad acoustics, someone pointed to a new slide. It was not a chart. It was a photograph, a tiny habitat on a wide red plain, and the room went quiet again, because now the mission was not just planned, it was waiting. Chapter 3. The quiet months between worlds. The crew did not travel to Mars in a straight line you could draw with a pencil. They traveled on a curve that belonged to gravity and fuel economy, a long arc that traded speed for affordability, a long arc that made time itself a consumable. After the last docking clamp was closed, after the final checklist was signed, and after the engines finished the burn that pushed them away from Earth, there was a moment when the noise stopped. The rocket sound was gone. The applause in mission control was gone. The headlines had already moved on to the next thing. Inside the spacecraft, there was only the ordinary hum of fans, air moving through filters, water circulating through a heat exchanger, a small world performing its first quiet day. In the archive, The first week is mostly routine, not because nothing mattered, because everything mattered. And the only way to carry that weight is to turn it into a schedule. The crew woke on a set clock. They checked their own bodies before they checked the ship. They measured sleep, hydration, heart rate. They logged mood in the careful language of professionals who refuse melodrama. Then they moved into systems, cabin pressure, CO2 scrubbers, humidity, battery state, the temperature gradient between the sunlit side and the shaded side. In a closed habitat, air is a shared resource. So is calm. So is courtesy. The mission plan included a rule that seems small until you live with it. If you move something, write it down. On Earth, this would be overkill. On a ship with limited storage, where the same wrench may be needed 100 times, it is survival. They called it the economy of objects. Every item had a place. Every place had a reason. And if you broke the map, you created a quiet emergency. Even their meals were designed like maintenance. Food packets labeled with calories and nutrients, a rotating menu to prevent boredom, a few rare items stored like tiny holidays, coffee, something sweet, a spice mixture that reminded one crew member of home. In one personal recording, a crew member describes the first time they opened the pantry after the earth burn. They say, "It looks like a store shelf in a storm shelter. It makes me feel safe. And then it makes me feel strange, because I know safety is being manufactured here. Safety was manufactured. That was the point. The ship had a radiation shelter, not a bunker. A region of the habitat where water tanks and supplies were arranged to add mass between the crew and space. In training, they had practiced using it. In flight, they treated it the way you treat a seatbelt. You do not sit in it all day. You do not forget that it exists. Solar weather was watched constantly, a quiet craft of prediction. If a flare was expected, the crew would adjust, sleep near the shelter, move tasks, reduce extraneous time in less protected areas. The archive does not dramatize this. It records it like a weather forecast. Elevated particle event possible. Shelter procedure recommended. On day 42, one such event occurred. It was not a catastrophe. It was a reminder. The crew moved into the shelter region with books and tablets and their own breathing. They waited. They listened to the ship. When the event passed, they moved out again. They made a small joke about how the shelter smelled like plastic and oranges. Someone had opened a citrus snack, and later, in the debrief, they wrote down the fact that citrus helped. This is what it meant to travel to Mars. Not constant drama, constant learning. Communication with Earth became its own kind of discipline. At first, the delay was barely noticeable. A few seconds, a strange pause. Then a week later, it became a conversation with breathing room, a question, then quiet, then an answer. You cannot argue well across that kind of delay. You cannot repair misunderstanding quickly. So the crew learned to speak differently, to be precise, to be generous, to assume the best. The mission psychologists had trained them for this. They called it delayed empathy. You speak as if the other person is tired. You speak as if the other person cannot interrupt you. You speak as if you may not get a second chance to correct yourself. This style of speech altered the crew. You can hear it in their recorded messages. They sound slower, not because they are bored, because they are choosing the shape of their words. The archive includes a long, calm exchange about a noise, a vibration that appeared in the fan assembly at certain RPM. On Earth, a technician proposes a test. The crew replies with a description and a recording. Then they wait. Then Earth replies. Then the crew performs the test. The solution is simple: a bearing that needs reseating, a mount that needs tightening. But the process takes 2 days, not because it is hard, because every step is paced by distance. Distance does not just change the view, it changes the tempo of problem solving. The ship had exercise equipment, a treadmill with a harness, a resistance machine, a cycle. This was not optional. It was not self-improvement. It was maintenance. Bones in microgravity begin to thin. Muscles begin to forget their jobs. Blood redistributes. The body rewrites itself. The crew exercised like people who understood that the landing would demand strength they could not improvise. They ran with straps that pressed them into the belt. They lifted against elastic forces. They recorded their metrics with the same seriousness as a fuel gauge. And then, after exercise, there was quiet time. Time that belonged to no checklist. In the archive, this is where the mission becomes human. A crew member reads an old novel aloud. Another learns a small piece of music and plays it softly through a speaker. Someone keeps a journal of small observations. How the light looks when it passes through a water droplet in zero gravity. How the cabin feels after you clean it. How silence is different when you know there is no wind outside. Cleanliness became a ritual, not because dirt was the enemy, because neglect is. They wiped surfaces. They vacuumed filters. They managed microbial growth. They treated the habitat as a living thing. If you care for it, it forgives you. If you ignore it, it becomes a threat. There were days when the crew felt cramped, not in a dramatic way, in the mild, persistent way that makes small annoyances feel large. The archive includes an incident report about a storage bin, a bin placed in the wrong location, a bin that blocked access to a panel, a bin that for a moment made a trained engineer raise their voice. Later, the same engineer records a private note. They say, "I was not angry about the bin. I was angry about the idea that we can make mistakes out here. But we can, so we must be kind." Kindness was treated as a system requirement. The crew also practiced surface procedures. They rehearsed suit checks. They drilled emergency depressurization. They practiced the slow choreography of an airlock, not because they were uncertain, because repetition turns stress into muscle memory. In some training scenarios, the crew would pretend that the habitat on Mars had suffered a leak. They would practice isolating modules. They would practice tracking pressure changes. In the archive, you can hear the calm cadence. Valve closed, reading stable, marking time. They practiced because Mars allows little forgiveness. As the months passed, the crew began to notice that Earth was no longer in the center of their view, not physically, mentally. Earth became a place they visited in messages, a place that existed in delayed images, a place whose weather and politics and daily noise felt distant. They were not escaping Earth. They were simply moving beyond its immediate influence. In one message to a friend, a crew member says, "It is easier to forgive people when they are far away. I can only hold one version of them in my mind, so I choose the gentle one." This was not a poetic flourish. It was a survival tactic. The ship also carried small experiments, plant growth in microgravity, material exposure coupons, sensors that measured radiation and dust. These experiments gave the crew something to tend, a sense that they were not just passengers, they were caretakers of knowledge. And slowly, almost without noticing, Mars began to grow in their daily conversations. They would discuss the landing site as if it were a neighborhood, the ridge to the west, the shallow basin, the location of the power systems, the habitat that had been waiting. They reviewed orbiter images. They looked at the small shapes their own cargo had left, the return vehicle, the solar arrays, the shadow of the habitat. It is a strange feeling to see a place that belongs to you when you are still far away. As they approached the halfway point, the mission plan included a small ceremony, not public, not symbolic, a practical milestone. They rotated roles. They reassigned some responsibilities. They held a meeting to confirm that everyone still agreed on how decisions would be made. This meeting was not about hierarchy. It was about preventing silent resentment. They called it a maintenance check for the crew. In the archive, the meeting ends with a sentence that is repeated 3 times, by 3 different voices. We will keep each other safe. We will keep the ship safe. We will keep the mission honest. Then they return to their schedules, to their fans, to their filters, to their steady work. Outside the hull, the space between planets did what it always does. It offered no sound, no mercy, no interference, and the spacecraft continued on. A small moving home, a patient machine, a handful of people turning time into distance. On some nights, the crew looked out at a sky without air. They watched the stars without twinkle. They watched Mars grow from a bright point into a small disk. They did not say much, because some experiences do not need narration. They simply kept going, and kept the ship alive, and kept their own minds steady. And that was the cruise. Not a montage, a season. A long, quiet season. Between worlds. Chapter 4. The thin air and the long blackout. By the time Mars filled more of the windows, the crew had already landed 100 times. In simulation, in rehearsals, in the slow imagination that comes from reading checklists until you can hear them in your sleep. Still, the real arrival was different, because the ship was not a model, because the crew's bodies were not the bodies they had on Earth, because Mars was not a training site. Mars was a planet, and planets do not care about your practice. The entry plan was written in layers. Top layer meant for the public, a simple narrative, a heat shield, a parachute, engines, landing. Under that was a thicker layer, a labyrinth of contingencies, alternate targeting, abort windows, fault detection, safe modes, procedures for a landing that could not be controlled in real time. Because of the distance. As the crew approached Mars, the communication delay was long enough to make supervision impossible. Mission control could not steer them down. Mission control could not watch in real time. The crew would descend alone, with their own training, with their own judgment, with software that had been argued over for years. The archive includes a line from an internal review. During entry, the crew will be the only people who can still change the story. Entry began with preparation that looked like ordinary housekeeping. Loose items secured, cabin configured, computers checked, a final review of emergency oxygen, a check of suit pressure. Then the crew entered their seats. Not because sitting is comfortable, because sitting is stable. In one recorded voice note, a crew member describes the smell inside the helmet. They say it is the smell of plastic and breath. They say it is familiar. They say it makes them feel strangely calm. The spacecraft performed a small maneuver, a rotation, a precise orientation. It turned its heat shield toward the direction of travel. And then there was nothing more to do. You cannot negotiate with the atmosphere. You can only arrive. The first touch of air was not felt as wind. It was felt as numbers, a deceleration curve, a heating rate, a pressure value that began to rise. The crew watched their instruments, not because they doubted the systems, because paying attention is part of the system. The heat built, the plasma formed. The radio became unreliable. Mars entry does this. It wraps the vehicle in an ionized sheath, a thin layer of fire that blocks signals. The archive records this as a time interval. Communications blackout expected. In popular culture, this is sometimes treated like suspense. A room full of people holding their breath. A dramatic countdown. In the real mission, it was quieter, because the people who had built the mission had already held their breath 1,000 times. They had used up their dramatic energy on spreadsheets. In mission control, they watched predicted telemetry. They watched models. They watched the path that had been planned. And they waited for the ship to speak again. Inside the vehicle, the crew experienced a kind of heavy motion, not the crushing acceleration of launch, a firm pressure that reminded their bodies what weight feels like. Their harnesses tightened. The sound changed. The hiss of air, the faint vibration of structure. The first major transition came with the deployment of the parachute. On Mars, parachutes are used not because they can do everything, but because they can do something. A thin atmosphere will not slow you enough, but it can slow you enough for engines to finish the job. Parachute deployment is a violent act. Sudden opening, a jerk, a shock that travels through cables and fabric. The crew felt it. They named it out loud. Shoot. That was all. No exclamations, no cheering. Just a note, like a surgeon announcing an incision. Then the parachute did its short work. The vehicle continued to fall. At a certain point, the heat shield was no longer needed. It separated, fell away. This moment is where the craft becomes vulnerable. Before this, the shield is a simple, blunt protection. After this, the craft exposes sensors, radars, cameras, the delicate organs it needs for the final steps. The guidance system began to search for the surface. It measured distance. It compared the real terrain to stored maps. It made small decisions. In the archive, the software is described as a kind of humility. It does not assume the planet will match the plan. It looks, it chooses. Then the engine's lit. A controlled roar, a push upward against the fall. The parachute was cut away. It had done its part. Now it was a liability. The vehicle slowed. The dust rose beneath it. A pale brown cloud. Not smoke. A planet's fine skin being disturbed. The crew could not see much through the dust, so they listened to their instruments. Altitude, vertical velocity, lateral drift. In the cabin, the crew's voices stayed calm. A checklist spoken aloud, a confirmation, then contact. Not a gentle kiss, a firm, short shock, a settling, a series of quick vibrations as legs absorbed energy, and then stillness. The first confirmation came as a line on a display, touchdown. The second confirmation came as the absence of motion, the sensation of being still in a place you have never been. The archive includes a small recording from the cabin. It is just breathing. Then one voice says, "We are down." Another voice replies, "We are down." Then a long pause, because the mind needs a moment to catch up. Outside, Mars was quiet. The thin air did not carry sound the way Earth does. Dust drifted. The sky was a muted color. Inside, the crew did not rush. There is a temptation to think that the first minutes are for celebration. In reality, the first minutes are for safety. They check seals. They check cabin pressure. They checked for leaks. They confirmed that power was stable. They confirmed that the habitat they had landed near was still responding. They waited for the dust to settle. They waited for temperatures to equalize. They waited for their own adrenaline to drain. In mission control, the blackout ended. The signal returned. A stream of data. A landing confirmation. People did not scream. They exhaled. They allowed themselves to sit back. They wrote timestamps. On the public broadcast, there was applause. On the private channel, there were mostly simple words. Good work. We see you. Take your time. The mission plan included a rule. No one leaves the vehicle immediately, not even to capture a moment, because Mars does not reward impulsiveness. The first exit would be done like everything else, slowly, deliberately, with respect. The crew's next task was not a flag. It was the airlock. It was the suit. It was the careful act of opening a boundary without losing the world inside. In the archive, the first suit up begins with a checklist that sounds almost tender. Check your hands. Check your partner. Check your seals. They moved with patience. They spoke quietly. In the airlock, there was a moment of stillness. The last moment of Earth-like air. Then the air was pumped away, not in a rush, in a controlled sequence. Pressure fell. The lock became a cold space. The suit became the home. Then the outer hatch opened. The first step onto Mars was not a dramatic leap. It was a careful shift of weight, a test of traction, a test of balance. The dust was finer than expected. It behaved like powder. It clung. The crew member paused, not for the cameras, for their own mind. They looked outward. They looked at the habitat. They looked at the return vehicle in the distance, a quiet machine waiting. Then they spoke. They did not deliver poetry. They delivered a status. Surface contact confirmed. It is the kind of sentence that holds history without noticing. Behind them, the second crew member exited, then the third, then the fourth. They stood in a small cluster, not because they were afraid, because humans gather. Then they began the first simple work. Check the lander, check for damage, check for dust ingestion, deploy a small antenna, confirm data link to the surface relays. Only after these tasks were complete did the mission allow itself a brief moment. A camera pointed at the horizon, a slow pan, a record. Mars did not respond. It simply existed, and that was enough. That day, the crew did not do much more. They moved into the habitat. They connected power. They began the first pressurization check. They took off their suits and listened to the air. They ate a meal that was not celebratory. It was simply warm. And that warmth meant everything. At the end of the day, one of them recorded a line. It is short. It is almost mundane. The dust is real. The silence is real. And the plan still works. Then they slept. On Mars, in a habitat that had waited. Outside, the thin air moved slowly over red ground. The sun set. The temperature dropped. And the mission entered its longest phase. Not entry, not landing, living. Chapter 5. A season of routines on red ground. If you only watched the first landing footage, you would think the mission happened in a single day. A descent, a boot print, a panorama. The archive tells a different story. It tells the story of mornings, of maintenance, of small decisions repeated until they become culture. The first week on Mars was devoted to making the habitat feel less like a delivered object and more like a home. Not in a sentimental way, in a practical way. The crew checked pressure seals. They checked the integrity of the airlock. They confirmed that the water system was stable. They activated the environmental controls and listened for unfamiliar sounds. A habitat on Mars is a compromise. It must be insulated against cold. It must be protected against radiation. It must be sealed against dust. It must still be light enough to land. No design is perfect. So the crew's job was to discover the imperfect parts before those parts became dangerous. They did this through routine. Each morning began with a health check, vitals, sleep quality, a brief self-report, then a habitat check, pressure, CO2 levels, humidity, filter loading, then a planning meeting, a small conference around a screen, not to debate, to align. On Mars, misalignment is costly. The crew lived on sols, not days. A Martian sol is slightly longer than an Earth day, so the schedule drifted. Morning moved through the clock. Lunch sometimes happened when the body wanted sleep. The mission allowed this. They did not force Earth time. They forced stability. The archive includes a note. Use light to shape sleep. So the habitat lighting shifted, brighter in the wake period, warm and dim towards sleep. This sounds like comfort. It is actually medical. Outside, the surface work began. Every EVA, every time a crew member left the habitat, was treated as an expedition. Not because the distance was always large, because the environment was always unforgiving. Suit checks, seal checks, communications checks, a checklist that becomes a chant, not to entertain, to protect. Mars dust is not like beach sand. It is sharp. It is fine. It clings electrostatically. It works its way into joints and seals. The mission planners had known this. So the base included dust mitigation, brush stations, air jets, a procedure for cleaning suits before re-entry. Still, the dust found new paths. It always does. In the first month, the crew logged a rising resistance in one airlock hinge. Not a crisis, a trend. They disassembled the hinge housing in a controlled environment. They cleaned it. They applied a lubricant designed for vacuum. They reassembled. They logged the result. The archive treats this as a success, because it is. They were not heroes. They were caretakers. Power management shaped the season. The solar arrays produced well under clear skies. Then the first haze arrived, a light veil, not a storm, just a reminder that Mars has moods. The generator carried more load. The batteries cycled. The crew began to talk about power the way sailors talk about wind. Good production today. Expect a low output period. They did not complain. They adapted. Science work was integrated into the routine like breathing. They sampled regolith. They checked for perchlorets. They drilled shallow cores. They looked for hydrated minerals. They mapped small outcrops. They were careful not to treat Mars as a treasure hunt. The mission was not about a single discovery. It was about becoming competent on another world. Competence is a form of knowledge. The crew also tended to instruments left by earlier cargo. Weather stations, seismometers, cameras. These devices were simple. They were designed to be boring. And boring is how you build data sets. The greenhouse rack was activated, not as a farm, as a symbol with practical benefits. The first sprouts were small, green against white trays. The archive includes a short note. The color made the room feel larger. Humans are wired for forests. A few leaves are enough to quiet part of the brain. Meals became events, not because they were elaborate, because shared meals are how groups remain groups. They ate, they talked, they maintained a rule about conflict. No conflict at mealtime. No conflict in the airlock. These rules were written in planning documents. They were also human tradition. They celebrated small milestones. First month. First long traverse. First major repair. The first major repair came quietly. A pump in the water loop began to draw more current. A sign of wear. A sign of grit. They had a spare. They practiced the replacement on Earth. Still, the task took a full soul, because the habitat was not a lab, because every part had to be handled without contamination, because tools behave differently when your gloves are thick. They replaced the pump. They tested. They monitored. Then they wrote a calm report. Pump replaced. System stable. Recommend earlier replacement schedule for next mission. This is how the archive grows. One repair becomes the safety margin for someone else. Communications with Earth remained delayed. By now, the delay was substantial. The crew would send a morning package, status, science highlights, requests. Earth would respond later, recommendations, questions, encouragement. In the archive, the encouragement is gentle, not cheerleading, respect. We see your work, we trust your judgment, take care of one another. The crew also had private channels, messages to family, to friends, to people who had promised not to demand optimism. In one message, a crew member says, "There is no smell outside. There is only dust and cold. But inside, we have coffee, and that is enough to feel human." The mission did not pretend that everything was easy. It made space for fatigue. There were low days. Days when the sky was flat. Days when an EVA was cancelled because of wind. Yes, there is wind on Mars. Thin but real. Days when the body felt heavy inside the suit. Days when someone missed the sound of rain. The crew handled this with structure. They had scheduled quiet time, scheduled exercise, scheduled personal projects. One crew member maintained a catalogue of rocks, not for science, for comfort. Each rock photographed, named, stored. Another crew member wrote small essays about light, about the horizon, about how the sun feels weaker. These essays were not dramatic. They were steady. They were the record of a mind refusing to collapse into novelty. The season of surface work included one anomaly. Not dangerous, just strange. A sensor near the solar array began reporting inconsistent temperature. It would spike, then normalize. At first, they suspected a loose wire, then a software glitch. They inspected, they cleaned, they reseated connectors. The spikes continued. Finally, they noticed a pattern. The spikes occurred after certain winds. Dust was accumulating differently. A thin layer was insulating the sensor, then a gust would strip it. They moved the sensor. They adjusted the mounting. They wrote it down. Dust behavior affects sensor thermal readings. Recommend shielding or alternate placement. The anomaly became another lesson. As months passed, the crew grew into the place. They learned the local patterns, how dust devils move, how the temperature drops fast after sunset, how the horizon looks close but remains far. They developed a relationship with the return vehicle, not a romance, a respect. They inspected it regularly. They kept its systems warm. They checked its propellant status. They treated it like an animal that must be cared for, because it was their way home. They also maintained the ascent plan in their minds. They rehearsed it. They reviewed the checklists. On Mars, the return is not an afterthought. It is a shadow on every day. The archive contains a phrase written in a crew notebook. Do not let the surface become too comfortable. Comfort can be a trap. It can make you careless. can make you reluctant to leave. So the crew held themselves to discipline. They kept the habitat orderly. They kept the suits maintained. They kept the return vehicle ready. And still, within that discipline, a kind of ordinary life emerged. They learned each other's rhythms. Who needs silence in the morning? Who talks while working? Who prefers to eat slowly? They developed small jokes, a nickname for a particular rock, a nickname for the air filter that always needed cleaning. These jokes did not undermine professionalism. They supported it. Because laughter is a pressure release valve. By the time the surface season reached its planned midpoint, the crew had done the quiet work that no highlight reel can show. They had proven that a habitat can remain stable. They had proven that humans can live inside a machine and remain kind. They had proven that Mars can be approached with respect. And the planet, in return, had offered what it always offers. Not welcome, not hostility, indifference. Indifference is honest, and honest environments make honest crews. In the final third of the surface stay, the crew began to shift their attention from exploration toward departure. They continued science, they continued maintenance, but now every task was also preparation. Supplies packed, samples sealed, habitat configured for dormant mode, because the mission plan was clear. The story would not end with a permanent camp. It would end with a return. And in the quiet hours, the crew sometimes stood outside the habitat at the edge of their EVA time. They looked at the sky. They watched the small sun. They watched dust move, and they listened, not to sound, to the absence of it. They did not say much, because they were saving their words for the long trip home. And that was the season. Not a conquest, a routine, a careful, sustained life on red ground. Chapter 6. The return and the afterimage. The end of a Mars mission does not announce itself with a single moment. It arrives the way seasons arrive, slowly. Then suddenly, you realize it is time. The surface timeline had always been written in advance, not as a promise, as a constraint. Mars launch windows are not negotiable. If you miss the window, you wait. And waiting on Mars is possible if you brought enough margin. But it is not the plan. So the crew began their departure preparation with the same discipline that had carried them through arrival. They reduced surface operations, not because they were tired of Mars, because departure is a complex task that demands attention. They performed a final maintenance cycle on the ascent vehicle. They inspected seals. They verified power. They confirmed avionics health. They confirmed propellant temperatures. They cycled valves. They treated the ascent vehicle the way you treat an instrument you must play perfectly. Once. The crew also prepared themselves. Medical checks, exercise, sleep discipline. They did not want to begin the ascent with depleted bodies. Samples were packaged, not like souvenirs, like evidence. Each container labeled, each container sealed, each container placed in a configuration that could survive vibration. In the archive, you can hear the care. The crew member reads a label out loud, then repeats it, then checks it again. This is not obsession. It is the understanding that a gram of return material can support years of science. It is the understanding that mistakes cannot be corrected easily. The habitat was configured for dormancy. Systems shut down in order. Some heaters left on. Some sensors left recording. A slow heartbeat. The habitat would wait. For a rescue mission. For a later crew. For whatever the future decided. Leaving a habitat behind is a strange act. It is like leaving a lit room in an empty house. The crew performed one last EVA, not to plant a flag, to close out the site. They checked the solar arrays. They secured loose equipment. They took final photographs, not for beauty, for record. Then they stood for a moment, 4 figures under a thin sky. They looked at the lander that had brought them down. They looked at the tracks they had made. They said a few simple words, not for broadcast, for themselves. Thank you. Not because Mars is a person, because humans have a habit of acknowledging places that changed them. Then the final suit cleaning, the final airlock cycle, the final night in the habitat. Sleep was light, not from fear, from anticipation. Ascent morning arrived. The ascent procedure was designed to be as automated as possible. Automation is not laziness. It is speed. It is precision. Still, the crew rehearsed each step. They confirmed each status. They verified each indicator. The ascent vehicle cabin was smaller than the surface habitat. It felt like a return to the ship that had carried them here. A reminder that this part of the mission was again a vehicle, not a home. They sealed the hatch. They checked pressure. They listened. The ascent ignition is recorded in the archive as a single event. Engine start. Chamber pressure stable. Then the ground fell away. Mars' gravity is weaker than Earth's, so the ascent felt different, less brutal, still decisive. The crew felt vibration. They felt the push. They saw dust through a small window. Then the dust became distance. They rose. They left the habitat behind. They left the tracks behind. On Earth, Mission Control watched delayed telemetry. They watched the past again. They could not help. They could only receive. The ascent vehicle staged. A spent stage fell away. A lighter stage continued. Then orbit. Orbit is not a destination. It is a meeting place. A return craft waited in Mars orbit. A vehicle that had been there, quietly circling, while the crew lived on the surface. It was the other half of the architecture. A layered plan. A plan built on redundancy. Rendezvous was performed with careful procedure, relative motion, range, rate, docking alignment. In the archive, docking is described as a gentle impact, a latch, a seal. Then the hatch opened, and the crew moved into the orbiting craft. They removed their helmets. They floated. They looked at one another. A moment of relief, not celebration, relief. Because now the mission had one clear direction: home. The transit back to Earth was not identical to the transit out. The crew carried Mars with them, in dust embedded in suit fabric, in small abrasions on tools, in the smell of their own habitat, in the knowledge that they had lived somewhere else. They also carried fatigue, the kind that comes from long vigilance, so the return plan emphasized rest, a slower schedule, more quiet time, more medical monitoring. Communication delay began to shrink. Messages became more conversational. Arguments could be repaired. Jokes could land in the same hour. The crew noticed Earth grow brighter, not in the window at first, in the mind. In one message, a crew member says, "I can almost taste rain. I know that makes no sense, but my brain is making weather." As the ship approached Earth, the mission entered another high-risk phase. Not because Earth is hostile, because re-entry is physics. The crew would not land the whole spacecraft. They would transfer into a return capsule, a vehicle designed to endure heat, a vehicle designed to survive a hard journey through air. They prepared the capsule. They reviewed the final procedures. Then separation. The capsule drifted away from the larger craft, a small object in a wide sky. Entry began. Heat built. Plasma formed. Radio went quiet. Another blackout, a shorter one, a familiar one. On Earth, people watched. They watched because they had been waiting for years. When the signal returned, the capsule was already deep in atmosphere, parachutes deployed, airs loaded, then landing. On Earth, landing is not the end. It is the beginning of recovery. The crew would be weak, their bodies adjusted to microgravity and Mars gravity. Earth gravity would feel heavy. So the recovery team moved quickly, not to create drama, to create comfort. The hatch opened. Air rushed in. Earth air, heavy with oxygen, heavy with smell. The crew blinked. They were carried out, not because they were helpless, because the mission plan respected biology. In the archive, one crew member laughs quietly. They say, "It is loud here. Earth is loud. It is loud in the obvious ways. Engines, voices, doors closing, the rumble of trucks on pavement. And it is loud in the subtle ways. The constant pressure of air on skin, the way fabric hangs instead of floating, the sound of your own footsteps returning." The crew had trained for Mars. They had trained for the transit. They had trained for descent and ascent. They had not trained for the first 10 minutes back on Earth, because Earth is not hostile. It is simply full of sensation, full of gravity, full of other people. The recovery plan accounted for this. The crew was moved through bright spaces quickly and into quieter rooms. Medical staff spoke in low voices. Lights were kept soft. Water was offered slowly. One crew member, recorded on a handheld mic, described the first sip. "It tastes like weight." It is a strange sentence. It is also accurate. The body that has lived without full gravity for so long feels Earth as a pressure. Blood settles differently. The head feels heavy. The legs feel like they belong to someone else. So the crew was helped into chairs. Straps were replaced with blankets. A pulse was taken again and again. They were asked the kind of questions that matter after a long mission. Are you dizzy? Are you nauseated? Do you feel pain? Can you focus your eyes? The answers were ordinary, tired, a little nauseated, grateful, overwhelmed. In the hours after landing, the crew heard sounds they had not heard in months. Birds, wind through trees, rain on a roof somewhere nearby. Later, when the first crowd noise reached them, it came through walls like surf. They listened to it the way you listen to distant weather. It was not for them exactly. It was for the idea of them. When the crew finally saw their families, the archive record became careful. Names were redacted in public versions, but you can hear the breathing change. You can hear a laugh that is not professional. You can hear someone say, "You are warm." Warm, because Mars is cold, even inside a habitat, and space is cold in a different way. In the days that followed, the crew slept in short blocks. Dreams lagged behind reality. More than one person reported waking up expecting to hear the habitat fan pattern. More than one person reported reaching for a handhold that was not there. This is the after image. The brain holds onto the world it has just lived in. It keeps it on the inside for a while. When the crew was strong enough, they were asked to watch the footage. The landing, the ascent, the long blackout. It felt strange, because the video showed a story, and the crew remembered a checklist. They listened to Earthside recordings too, a control room counting seconds, voices that stayed calm for the sake of other people, a kind of professional tenderness. For the first time, the crew understood what the planet had experienced while they were out of reach, waiting, watching delayed numbers, hearing only silence, This did not make the crew feel heroic. It made them feel connected, because a mission like this is never only the people in the vehicle. It is also the people who keep the lights on at home. In the weeks that followed, the mission entered its final phase. Not flight, after image. There were medical tests, physical therapy, interviews, debriefs, the slow work of turning experience into procedure. The crew wrote reports, not for fame, for the next crew. This hinge collects dust. This schedule is too tight. This meal plan needs more variety. This lighting pattern helped sleep. These notes are the real treasure of the mission, because they convert one expedition into a repeatable act. The returned samples were distributed to labs, to archives, to institutions that would spend years reading a story written in minerals. The public celebrated, the news ran montages, the world argued about cost, about meaning, about what should come next. In the archive, there is a quieter record, a note from a logistics officer. It reads, "The supply chain did not break. This is a kind of miracle. In time, the mission became part of culture. Children memorized the names of the crew. Documentaries used dramatic music. Politicians used the mission as a metaphor. The crew watched this with mixed feelings. They were proud. They were tired. They were protective of the truth. Because the truth was not a heroic sprint. It was a long discipline. And somewhere on Mars, the habitat remained. A small manufactured cave, a locked room, a set of batteries and heaters waiting. The return vehicle stages lay where they had fallen, a scattering of metal, a record of ascent. The planet continued. Dust moved. Seasons turned. Mars did not care that humans had visited, but humans cared. Not because Mars gave them a trophy, because Mars changed the scale of what felt possible. In the years after the first mission, the archive grew. More cargo flights, more habitats, more relays, more deliberate steps. A second crew arrived with better tools. A third crew arrived with more comfort. The first mission became, in hindsight, a rough draft, a proof that the story could be written. And if you listen to the original recordings, if you listen beyond the broadcast, you hear something steady, a kind of quiet confidence. Not that everything will go well, but that we can do hard things without turning them into spectacle. That we can build small, forgiving worlds. That we can travel far and still choose kindness. And so, as the archive closes for tonight, we return to the simplest truth. A mission to Mars is not a moment. It is a long chain of ordinary days, linked together by careful work, carried by patience, and completed by a return. This was a quiet archive story, where the story ends, sleep begins,